Pivot table slicers or a slicer is a quicker way to filter your data in a pivot table. In other words, if I insert a field here as a slicer like the salesperson, it'll have a list of all the salespeople as buttons within a small slice of a window pane, if you will, that I can quickly click on to filter for that salesperson, as opposed to clicking on the drop-down arrow, unchecking, and then checking one of the salespersons to filter in for. It takes too much time. In any case, to go ahead and insert a slicer or slicers, you can come up here and click on the Insert tab, go to the Filters group because it is a filter, click on Slicer, brings up the window, let me close out, or if you have a cell selected anywhere within the pivot table, you can also come up to its related Contextual Analyze tab and then go to its filter group and click on Insert Slicer. You can see it brings up the same window. And then go ahead and check those fields that you want to insert a slicer for, to filter for, like salesperson, product, and total, and click Okie dokie, and there you go. Now I'm going to go ahead and organize these by hovering over the top part, the title bar of each slicer until I can see a four-way arrow, then click and drag it over and over to not have them stacked. Now that doesn't mean that you still can't filter the old school way, which is coming over here in the pivot table and clicking on the drop down arrow, unchecking, and then checking what you want to filter in and clicking OK. That works. But keep in mind that these slicers are connected to that pivot table. So what you filter there, it'll display the results of it also over in these slicers. Let me go ahead and close out of the field list so I can see that other slicer. So how do I know just by looking at the slicers which field has been filtered? Because I only filtered one, and that was a salesperson, and I can tell by looking in the pivot table what I filtered for by looking at the arrow and seeing if there's a funnel. If there's a funnel there, that means that I filtered for that field. I didn't do it for the date or for the company. So how can I tell by looking at the slicers here? Just look in the top right hand corner for the funnels there. Notice that this one is bold with the red X. These other two are faded. The faded ones means that I haven't selected either in the slicer or over in the pivot table, in this case a person there for that salesperson field. So you can see that Bob Appleman, when we filter for his name, the results over here says that he sold fort tent, screen tent, tiki torch, and you can see the results there of the products he sold. Now this is the quantity and this is the total in sales, the dollar amounts, so we're not going to compare those. And of course on different dates here. And I could bring up the date slicer if I want. Again, you can come back up here, insert, filter, slicer, check the date, but I'm going to keep it simple. Let's close out. And to go ahead and reset this, I can either click on the drop down arrow and check all, or since these are connected, I can go ahead and hover over that filter there and it gives me the option to clear it. Click on it and we're back to where we started. Now, doing it that way is a bit slower than just coming over here and selecting it and boom, automatically filters. I didn't have to click down, uncheck, and check. And if I want to do multiple filters within the same field, hold down the control key and click on the others and give them a second or two to update, and there you go. I'm going to go ahead and select one. And when I do that, so there's the filter for Brett Hume. Here are the results, and here are the results over here in the slicers. And then over in the slicers, if I want to do more than just filtering for one field, let's also say Britt Hume sold campfire bags. Let's focus on that. And there's his total there. Now notice the different colors of buttons here. We've got the dark blue, then we have the faded blue, and then we have the white with dark text and the white with faded text. Let me break it down. The dark blue buttons are those that have been selected or are filtered in. In other words, we selected these two, so they're going to be dark blue. This other one we didn't select, but it was filtered in because it met the other two's conditions or criteria. So it had to be Britt Hume, and it had to be a campfire bag, and total said, oh, hey, I meet both of those, and here's the total for the campfire bag that Britt Hume sold. Now I could go ahead and select it, and then it brings up the clear filter field. I'll go ahead and clear it. It doesn't matter. It still meets the criteria whether I select it or just leave it as is. So there's the dark blue. The results of selecting it, or that it's the result of meeting the conditions set by the other filters, the other slicers that we filtered for. Then the faded blue here is that it's part of a group that was selected but not meeting the other slicers' filter criteria. So that met it, but these didn't, so they're light blue. And then we've got the white buttons with the dark text, meaning that it was unselected or not filtered in, but it meets the condition of the other one that we have filtered for. Now see if this makes sense because it works both ways. When I selected Britt Hume, it went over to the product, as you recall, before we filtered it, and it said, let me clear it, it says, okay, he sold these three here. When I selected campfire bag, it's still saying over here in the products that even though you selected that, we still have the other two that are going to be in dark text that he sold. But because you didn't select it, it still, well, fits with what you have selected, but because you're not filtering for it, we'll just display it as dark text to let you know that he still made sales in other areas. You just don't want us to filter for it, so we'll display it in dark text. And those sales that he didn't make for these products, they'll be faded, which is good to know, because if I go down this road or this branch and I go, he did okay there, he better make up for it in sales in other areas or other products. What other products did he sell? I can quickly look over here and go, oh, let me look for those buttons that are displaying dark text, and that way I don't have to start over again to find out, by clearing the filter here, to find out which three he made sales on. I can just select one of them, and the other two that are in dark text he made sales on, I just need to go ahead and select it to filter for. There we go. Now keep in mind, this is for the default style that I have for my slicers. So when I go ahead and I select one here and I come up to its related contextual options tab, you can go ahead and choose a style and go purple for salespeople. Product will be orange and total can be green. I mean, it's still the same concept. The dark purple is going to be what you selected, or it's filtered in, the result of what you have selected. You can see over here, those are the results of these two filters there. When you're done, you can go ahead and click on clear, clear, and we're back to where we started. Oh, just look at that splash of color. Now, if you want to go ahead and connect these slicers to another pivot table, so in other words, you can hit two birds with one stone, wherein when you select Bob Appelman, not only will it filter for this pivot table, but if you have another pivot table, it can filter for him as well. So let's go ahead and insert another pivot table by using the same database here on sheet 1. Click anywhere within the database, come up here, click on the Insert tab, go to the Tables group, click on Pivot Table, and let's do a new worksheet, click Okie dokie, and that becomes sheet 5. So sheet 5 is my second pivot table, and let's go ahead and add salesperson, company, date, product, quantity, and of course I may want to rearrange this here. Let's do salesperson up here, date below that. So we can come down here on the worksheet 5 and just call it P2 for pivot table 2. And then sheet 1, we'll just double click and call it P1 for pivot table 1. And then sheet 1 here is going to be our database. Hit enter. Okay. Now there's two ways you can connect a pivot table to a slicer. You can do it one by selecting a slicer here and then coming up to its related contextual options tab. Go to the slicer group and click on report connections. You can see here that pivot table 1 on sheet 1 is already connected to, and then you can check it and say connect it to the pivot table on sheet 2, or P2, which is the name of the sheet there. And click Okie dokie, and it's connected. Or the other way, and probably quicker way, if you want like the pivot table on pivot table 2 worksheet connected to all these slicers that are open and available, select a cell anywhere within the pivot table, then come up here and click on the Analyze tab. Go to the Filter group, click on Filter Connections, and it says select the filters, that are slicers, to connect to this pivot table. Now we already connected one of the slicers, which is a salesperson. You can quickly check the others to connect them all and click Okie dokie. So either way will work. It just depends on if you want to do it for all of them. I think that's the quicker way than to do it by one slicer at a time. So if I go back to pivot table 1, the worksheet, and I do it for Bob Appelman, then when I go to pivot table 2, it should be filtered just for Bob Appelman. Cool. So they're all connected. Now, how could that be a benefit? Why would I want two separate pivot tables based upon the same database if they're showing the same things? Well, that's the point. You may not want to show the same things. You may want to go ahead and have additional fields here, or maybe just a couple of fields that are tied to the slicers here that you can analyze on two separate worksheets, or of course you can insert the pivot table on the same worksheet as the first pivot table, but it gets a little squishy for me, so that's why I put them on two separate worksheets, and be able to have a second way of analyzing your data from the same database and not be locked into just a set of fields what you see here, but you can put some here and put from the same database other fields here with a few that will link between the two. So if we want to connect them both to the same slicer, when we filter, it filters for both tables there. And then of course to disconnect, you can go ahead and select the slicer, come up here, click on the Options tab, go to the Report Connections, disconnect it from the pivot table 1 or the first one we have on P1 sheet or from P2. Or again, if you want to do it across the board, it's easier to go ahead and select a cell within the pivot table on pivot table 1 or pivot table worksheet 2 and come up here, Analyze, go to Filter Connections, and then uncheck it for that pivot table that you selected. Now there's an option that you can prevent slicers from moving or resizing with cells, and to go ahead and look at these options, select a slicer and then come up here, click on the Options tab. You can go to the size group, and when you hover over the expandable dialog box button, it's not just the size but also the properties that when you click on it, it expands the task pane for that slicer. Or let me close out, you can of course right click on the slicer and there it is, Size and Properties, brings up the same task pane. Go ahead and turn down Properties and you can see that the default is to move but don't size with cells. Now what that means is that if I resize the cells here, it would actually resize the slicer, but because it says you can move it but don't resize it, they won't be resized. What does it mean by move? Well, if I come up here, let me right click on column G and insert, it shifts over the slicer, it moves it. When I go ahead and click and drag and resize a cell, it doesn't resize the slicer. Let me go ahead and hit undo a couple of times. So when I have a slicer selected, that's what it means. You can go ahead and have the slicers move and size, or just have it move but don't size, or don't move or size with the cells. So whenever I go ahead and adjust the cell's height or width, it doesn't adjust with it. When I insert or delete a range of cells, it doesn't move the slicer with it. So let me go ahead and show you when you have move and size with cells selected. So if I go ahead and click and drag this out, let me drag that out. There you go. It's got to be within the range here, so it actually resizes the slicer there when I click and drag one of the column headers or do it for the row header. Oh, that's horrifying. Just look at that. Let's go ahead and undo. Let's go back to the default here. I guess it might be okay to move it with it, or just simply say don't move or size no matter what I do to the cells. And then finally, to remove the slicer, it's pretty easy. Let's just go ahead and close out of here. You can right click on the slicer and say remove, or you can go ahead and select it, hit the delete key, delete, and then of course you may want to restore this back to all if you forgot to do that, and click okie dokie to restore it. And then pivot table 2 is still there. Click on the drop down arrow, select multiple, choose all. If you want to use multiple items, and click okie dokie, and we're back to where we started, to where nothing's now filtered. Thanks for watching. Hey, as a quick reminder, if you like my video, please give it a thumbs up. You can also click on me and subscribe to my channel, get notified of the latest videos, and for only $2 a month, you can have access to all my Microsoft Office training videos.